Yeah, I went in as a tourist. I was amazed they let me in, but they did. And when I was in there, I was about the only tourist I saw anywhere. The incident you're talking about occurred when I went up to Homs, which is Syria's third city and one of the real hotspots. I checked into the hotel. I was the only guest there. Went out on the streets. It was incredibly tense. There were police and plainclothes thugs with guns on every corner. Most of the shops were shut. The government buildings were protected by sandbag gun emplacements. I took a taxi out into some of the poorer areas of the city, and there were at every major intersection 4 tanks guarding every corner. On the very edge of the city heading north, I saw more than 100 tanks lined up waiting in preparation for further trouble. I got into trouble when I was stopped at a roadblock. They saw stamps for Libya and for Egypt in my passport and naturally were suspicious. They took me into what I can only describe as a sort of secret detention centre. It was in a windowless basement of an anonymous apartment block. When I got there, I was put in a corridor. At the far end of the corridor was a heavy steel door, and just outside that door was a great mound of belts and shoelaces. And their provenance became apparent when my taxi driver was led in. They opened the steel door, and inside I could see literally scores of young men sitting huddled on the floor. And quite clearly the regime had been going around the streets of Homs arresting any young man of fighting age and putting him into this and presumably other detention centres. And I was held for about 6 hours, and during that time, at regular intervals, young men were brought in like that. Some of them were literally whimpering with fear, others were quite defiant. But it gave me a glimpse of the lengths to which this regime is going to suppress this insurrection.
So this experience is happening to many other people as well at the moment. Then, I mean, what happens to those who were detained? You obviously got out safely, others perhaps not so lucky.
I don't like to think what's happening to the other people who are being detained. I can only guess. There is a lot of fear in Syria, but it's fear of two sorts. There is fear of the regime, but there is, on the other side, there's a lot of fear of what would happen if Assad falls, because the government has very effectively promoted the idea that he is the only person who stands between security and a collapse, a disintegration into sectarian warfare of the sort that has happened in both Iraq and Lebanon, on each side of Syria. It's a very complicated story. There's a lot of anger, obviously, at the government, but there's a lot of anger at the protesters. Assad still has quite a lot of support in Syria, and a lot of people think the protesters are disrupting normal life. They simply want this to be over. One diplomat said to me, he said about 20% of the population love Assad, about 15% hate him. All the rest probably just want this all to be over. They want to return to their normal lives. It's not as simple a story as it's sometimes portrayed as in the outside world.
Now, you went in undercover and you've got a good overview of what was happening there. How damaging do you think it is that journalists aren't allowed access to report on this?
I think it's a much more nuanced story than you generally realise. My own sense is that this is the biggest and most serious challenge to the Assad dynasty in its 41 years. But having said that, it's not like Egypt, it's not like Libya. I don't get a sense that this is an insurrection that is catching on across the country. There's anger, but there's not rage. As I said before, Assad has some support still. The regime, unlike the one in Libya, is united, both the government and the military. There haven't been mass defections, as you saw there and in Libya. By the same token, the opposition has no focal point like it did in Cairo, in Tahrir Square. It's scattered across maybe 70, 80 smallish towns and cities. They don't have much purchase in either Damascus, the capital, or in Aleppo. They're not coordinated. They don't even necessarily have the same demands. the Facebook revolution, that's a term that doesn't really apply in Syria. Facebook is useful for getting video out, but most of the relevant sites are run from outside the country. They're not an organising tool. There's not going to be any Western military intervention as there has been in Libya. I think there is little chance of this insurrection removing Assad in the near future. Having said that, it may prove a bit of a Pyrrhic victory for the regime, because this is clobbering the economy, which was already in very dire straits. 15% of the economy depends on tourism. I was literally the only tourist there. I met one couple from Australia and that was it. The regime is printing money to try and so it can increase salaries and so it can subsidize fuel. So that's going to lead to inflation. Unemployment is already high, and that's going to rise. 6 months down the road, a year down the road, you might find that if the economy is in a nosedive, this revolution, which at the moment, the protesters at the moment can be measured in tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, and they're fairly limited to poorer Sunnis. But if the economy nosedives, you could find a much broader base of support. You know, the middle classes who are presently sitting on the sidelines could join in, and that would be a much more serious challenge.